Thank you to Katie for reading our scripture for today. A difficult reading, a difficult task. I was going to read it again, but I think I'm just going to let that be. And thank you for your music today, you all. It's fantastic. I'm looking forward to what yet you have planned, so thank you. If you were to have sat me down in August or in July, I remember the month, that we were planning this sermon series for this quarter, where it's called Savage, Hard Sayings of Jesus. If you haven't been with us, we've been working through these difficult passages where Jesus says stuff that kind of causes you to stop, maybe causes you to want to just read over the thing and let it be and move on to the next thing, right? Difficult sayings, difficult passages from Jesus. We've been working through this. So if you would have sat me down this summer and said, Kris, which of these passages would you prefer someone else to preach on? Which of these would you kind of just rather pass the buck? Let Dave Thomas preach on it, or let one of the other pastors preach on it. Which of these leaves you feeling scared and exposed and ill-prepared and all the other things? Which of these, and it would without a doubt have been the passage assigned to me today. The Lord works in mysterious ways. And it's not because I don't care about divorce or marriage. If anything, it's because I care a little bit too much. And it's not because I don't have any life experience. Those of you who know me well know that a great deal of my life has been shaped by divorce. My mom and my dad split up when I was just an infant. I grew up here in Walla. My dad was on the other side of the country. My mom and my stepfather split up when I was in junior high, and that was about the time that my wife's parents separated. And actually, Paige and I, we connected first as friends in junior high because of that shared experience. And even today, our relationship, in many ways, the bedrock of our relationship is this shared experience of suffering. We know and see and understand each other in ways that are really, really significant for us. Divorce has been a huge part of my life and my story. And if life has taught me anything, it's taught me that divorce is really hard, that it's really ugly, that it's painful, often for years or decades or generations. It's not good. And if life has taught me anything, it's also taught me that sometimes divorce is the next right step. And it's really difficult for me to live in that tension. And some of you, maybe even the majority of us here, know the tension that I'm talking about. And so as a preacher, I'm terrified. I'm terrified of standing up here and speaking to people whom I love and I care about who have been affected by this thing. And I'm terrified of coming across as judgmental or as condemning, or I'm terrified of shaming people for the experience that they've gone through. And I'm terrified as a preacher also to stand up here and speak to some who maybe are not yet married, or maybe some who are thinking about divorce, but for whom divorce is not yet the right next step. And I'm terrified of somehow giving permission or making it not seem like it's that big of a deal, or somehow glossing over this experience that's really hard. I'm terrified. And maybe some of you, as Katie read our scripture this morning, maybe some of you felt some of that apprehension and wish that I would preach on something different as well. And if you feel that way, we're in the same boat together at least. You know, it's possible that I didn't want to preach on this text because I knew I would need to give a disclaimer like this, and I hate disclaimers at the beginnings of sermons. I hate it. I hate it when preachers do this, and yet here I am. I'm making a disclaimer about a disclaimer. It's like Inception, you know? It's really an amazing thing. So just at the outset of this time together, I want to ask for your grace, not just for me, but for one another. And I just want to acknowledge that this is not a theoretical, theological plaything for many of us. Many of us don't have that liberty. For many of us in this room, this is real life. And when Jesus says the things that he says in the passage that we just read, it hits close to home. So I want to invite us to pray once more. Jesus, I pray that you live and breathe and move in us, just as the Spirit of God lived and moved and breathed through you. Amen. You can tell something about a person by what surprises them. You can tell something about a person by what surprises them. I have this silly video that I got off the internet about a boy being surprised by his mom. He was begging her to, and I have the video here, but I don't have any sound attached on purpose. I asked the guys not to play the sound, but I have a video of this boy whose mom, he was pestering his mom to give him this jar of unsweetened cocoa powder, right? Just desperate. He knew that he had to have this unsweetened cocoa powder, begging for it. I must have it. And mom finally relents after so much debate, and there it goes, down the hatch. And then he's... Right. You know, sometimes we're unpleasantly surprised, right? You can tell something about a person by what surprises them. And of course, some of us have that child in our home. Many of us have more than one of those children in our home. But you can tell something about what surprises a person. And in this passage for Matthew chapter 19 this morning, the disciples react with surprise to what Jesus has to say. And the basis of the sermon today is to ask, why? Why would they be surprised by what he has to say? Why would it be? What about them could help explain why it was surprising that Jesus would make such a strident stand about marriage? Why? And maybe that's an answer or a question that you could discuss over Sabbath dinner at home. I have two possible answers for us this morning, but I by no means think they're exhaustive. The first one's very, very quick, and the second one is a little bit longer, and then we'll be done. The first possible reason why the disciples were surprised, I think it may be connected to verse 6 in the text, or it might be explained by verse 6. Jesus says, "So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." Now, it's possible to read that verse from Jesus, what God has joined together, let no one separate. It's possible to read that as prescriptive, like Jesus is saying, you must not separate this. You could read it as a command, like Jesus is saying, you can't, don't try to do it, you can't do it, right? It's a command. There's another way of reading it that might be more descriptive, right? Where Jesus is describing reality. He's describing the universe how it is, that when we connect ourselves to another human being, especially in marriage, but I think in any relationship, when we connect ourselves to another human being, there's something that will be there forever. There's something that's connected. And we may have to separate, We may have to split. We may have to not be together. The relationship may become unsafe, where it's not okay for anybody to be around anybody, but there is still some connection on a spiritual level. We are tied to that person, even if it's only memory that's left. Relationships cannot be annulled. They can change, but we can't just make them disappear. And I wonder if part of the disciples' surprise might be an assumption on their part that by going to the courthouse, you can just make the thing go poof and disappear. I wonder if in their minds it was a little bit easier to make it go away than it actually is. I wonder if they were shocked a little bit by Jesus' thing, that no, it's not quite that simple. It's possible that the disciples were surprised because Jesus sort of lends new gravity to this human experience and says, no, it's actually a really, really big deal. Jesus reminds them that something happens on the soul level. This reminder maybe almost kind of comes across as, me and Paige's warnings to our kids when we had our cat at home, to our kids, like, hey, you guys, you play with a cat like that, it's going to bite you. If you pull on its tail, it's going to bite you. Right? It's just a reminder that if you're flippant with this thing, it could come around to affect you. And it's possible, I think, that the disciples could have had some surprise. They may have just not been taking this whole thing seriously enough. And I think on the surface level, that's probably the way that most of us, at least for me, read the passage. That's how it comes across just immediately. Oh, well, they're just not taking it seriously. So that's one reason why they might have been surprised. A second possible reason, at least from my perspective, of why the disciples might have been surprised is related, but a little bit different. It might have been in that time and place that divorce was quite common. It might have been that in the disciples' minds that it was normal for people to go through divorce. It might just happen. It's just part of life, and you expect it, and it happens. And so they're shocked in verse 10, and they say, well, why should we get married? Why should people get married at all if it's like that? For them, it might have been a very, very common. In many ways, it's true in American culture. Divorce, especially for pop American culture, divorce is quite common, quite normal. So look back at the original question posed by the religious teachers in verse 3. The text says, some Pharisees, some religious leaders, came to him to test him, and they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? The question is referencing an ongoing debate in that religious community in that time and place, looking at Deuteronomy chapter 24 especially. And this text indicated that a man could choose to divorce his wife if there was something displeasing about her or if she did something indecent. And it commands her and says he must give her a certificate of divorce if he divorces her. Now, that's a mouthful that I just gave. There's a lot there about equality and gender and justice and injustice, and we're only going to barely scratch the surface of it, and for that I apologize. But certainly in the time and place that Deuteronomy was written and went into effect, women were not equal with men, and only men could take action in a divorce like that. And many commentators actually write that only women were able to be seen as ones who would do something to bring about a divorce. So women had no power in the situation. It was completely based on a man's decision. And you might have even heard some commentators or preachers point out that this certificate of divorce was a step in the right direction for looking after and protecting women in that time and place. That this certificate gave them some modicum of legal protection, and that's probably true. But the situation for women when Jesus comes on the scene isn't significantly more advanced than the time of Deuteronomy. And we can even discern some of that reality right in this Matthew text itself. Look at the context of this dialogue. Here is a group of males asking a male-centric question of Jesus. When is it okay for a man divorce his wife for any and every reason? It's completely male-oriented. So here they are discussing the fate of women in their lives together. In any case, there's an ongoing debate amongst the religious community about how to interpret this text, Deuteronomy chapter 24, teasing out exactly what does it mean. What's going on here? What constitutes displeasing a husband? What constitutes indecent? What's the legal grounds? And there were different schools of thought for interpreting it. There was sort of one school of thought that was pretty broad, gave a lot of latitude, and said essentially anything that's displeasing could include if a husband decides that they found someone that was more beautiful, right? So that's kind of one sort of school of thought. And you could imagine how common that might make divorce, yeah? And then there's another school of thought that said, no, it only applies to adultery only, right? So there's kind of different, and this is the debate that the religious leaders are asking Jesus to weigh in on. How do you interpret this text? How do you interpret this debate? And some commentators, if you read, actually said that there were some people who said that divorce was compulsory under any of those conditions. So if a man had something displeasing about their wife and they did not divorce them, that they would actually be sinning. So if they decided to stick around. And all of this is to say that divorce very, very likely could have been quite common, and certainly on the part of men, quite easy to access with a low entry fee. And hence, the disciples' reaction of surprise as Jesus lays out this different system that would make divorce a little bit, or quite a bit even, more rare, they are shocked. And in verse 10, they respond. If that's the situation, they say, it's better to not get married in the first place. Now, I have to admit, it's really hard for me to not really strongly judge the disciples right here. Because the more I read their response, and the more I think about what they said in the context of this conversation, the more crass and disgusting it comes across to me. Now, it may not be for you, but for me, with my life and my background, I have a really difficult time not coming down very hard on them. And you might not agree, and I bless you, and we don't have to argue about it, but the more I read it, the more it comes off to me as, why get married at all if you have to pick just one? And it's sick. Can you imagine actually feeling and thinking that way about other people? Now, it's possible, I grant that I may be being harsh, and it's possible that in this context, a male-initiated divorce was just so common and so normal, it would not have occurred to the disciples that what they were saying was problematic or offensive in any way. They may have honestly never slowed down to consider how this system might have affected a whole half of the population that they were among. It's possible, and so I think for some of us we could give them a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt. But I think that's the subtext of this whole interaction, of this whole dialogue. Absolutely, Jesus is raising the standard on marriage. Absolutely, he's talking about divorce. He elevates the conversation from mere pragmatic religious dogma to spiritual principles. Absolutely, that's what Jesus is doing here. Absolutely, he paints a picture of what marriage should look like in the kingdom of heaven. In many ways, it's sort of like what he does with the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, or tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, turn the other cheek. I think he's doing something like that here with marriage, absolutely. And in doing so, I think he's also very quietly taking action from preventing women from being dehumanized by a status quo that is broken. There's a part of this response, this dialogue in Matthew chapter 19 that I don't think is about divorce and remarriage and marriage at all. I think underneath this hard saying is a rebuke from Jesus of any system, especially any religious system that is used to abuse and take advantage of or dehumanize vulnerable people among us. We can see it right in the beginning, the basis of the whole conversation in verse 3. It says the religious leaders come to Jesus, what? To test him. They ask the question to entrap him. They're not interested in what's good. They're not interested in what's best. They're not interested in what's best for relationships. They're not interested in what's right for society. They don't care about kids like me who are affected by this dynamic. They don't care about any of that at all. They're interested in power and control. That's the basis of the entire conversation. They could care less how their theological conclusions would affect real people. They could care less how their policy dehumanized half of the population. It didn't bother them in the slightest that their decisions in closed-door rooms devoid of the voices of women could expose real human beings created in the image of God to exploitation, financial ruin, and emotional shipwreck. They didn't care. For them, the conversation wasn't about the holy endeavor of marriage. It was about religious authority and trying to get gotcha on Jesus. And I imagine it's more than anything else that it's this game that Jesus is reacting to and takes exception to. You know, over and over and over again throughout the Gospels, Jesus sticks his neck out to legitimize and give voice to the outsider and the disdained and the condemned and the overlooked and the neglected. Over and over and over again, Jesus tangles with religious protocol in order to protect and give mercy to real people in flesh and blood standing in front of him. He'd rather skirt the edge of Sabbath rules than leave a maimed man mutilated. He'd rather overstep a purity law than leave a woman that was chronically ill to bleed. He'd rather scandalize a village than let slip the chance to show kindness and humanity to a many times divorced Samaritan woman gathering water at the well. He'd rather risk accusations of blasphemy than fail to legitimize the genuine faith of a Roman soldier from a competing religious tradition over and over and over and over again. And while our impulse as religious Christian insiders might be to dice down into the nitty-gritty of exactly what is allowed and what's not allowed in spiritual community, Jesus' impulse seems to be to make sure that his religious community's policy isn't so tone-deaf that it damages the most exposed people within it. Some version of the dialogue that takes place in Matthew chapter 19 also shows up in Luke, and it also shows up in Mark. But there's a passage in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, that while it isn't an exact parallel, it's eerily familiar. It sounds very much the same. And I want to close this morning by briefly looking at this passage in John, because I think it puts some flesh and blood on what it looks like for us to react as a church community to some of these dynamics. Many of us here are familiar with the story that shows up in John chapter 8. It lays out this dialogue where instead of religious leaders merely posing a doctrinal question aimed at entrapping Jesus, they do this very thing, but also not with a theoretical person's life on the line, but with the life of an actual, real human being, a woman said to have been caught in the very act of adultery. Of course, the text doesn't report on the horrifying violation that almost certainly allowed for that discovery. Not unlike Matthew 19 and Mark 10 and Luke 16, the stakes are laid out in the exact same way in religious terms. Jesus, what do you think about this interpretation? What do you think about what Moses would say? All the while, a real human being, a real person, by their hands, shoved to the ground in the dirt in front of them, humiliated, ashamed, exposed, vulnerable, laying in front of a gathering crowd. And not unlike Matthew chapter 19, our text for the day, the religious establishment in the story could seemingly care less about the plight of this human being made in the image of God. They were far more interested in maintaining spiritual power in their community. Their goal was not to discern the truth. Their goal was to protect privilege. The goal wasn't an honest inquiry into what was right. Their goal was to demonstrate their authority over this prophetic rock star. They wanted compliance. And into this situation, Jesus, not terribly unlike the discussion in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus confronts the injustice at an angle. Whoever among you is sinless, let that person be the one to throw the first stone. And those of you who know the story know that the power brokers began to walk away. It says the oldest to the youngest, they dropped their stones and left them there at the scene. And Jesus and the woman were left there. And Jesus speaks to her and says, where are they, those who condemn you? And she says, no one, sir. And neither do I condemn you. Go and find a new life free of sin. I think in this story, Jesus gives us an example as the church, a demonstration for our whole denomination even, a model for how we ought to live and move in the world, how we ought to relate to when it comes to all matter of religious law, whether it's veganism or Sabbath or drugs and alcohol or ordination or drums, or porn, or divorce, or whatever it happens to be. It's a model for how we might relate. I began this sermon telling you why I didn't want to preach this sermon. I didn't choose it. And I honestly have no desire to adjudicate what's okay and what's not okay and what counts as abuse and whether or not it's okay to get divorced in this situation or that situation or what qualify. I have no desire to adjudicate over that and to make statements from the front. And honestly, I don't trust anybody who does relish that. And maybe you guys don't want that responsibility either. But you know what we can do? You know what we must do? We can be kind. We can embody the real and living mercy of Jesus Christ in our lives by our words, by our actions. We can give grace. We can wrap our arms around people who are vulnerable in our community and speak confidently with the words of Jesus. Where are they who condemn you? They're not here. They're not here. The benediction today is a prayer written by Walter Brueggemann based on Jeremiah chapter 23. We're among your called. We have heard and answered your summons. You have addressed us in the deep places of our lives. In responsive obedience, we testify as we are able to your truth as it concerns our common life. We thank you for your call, for the burden of that call, for the risk that goes with it, for the joy of words given us by your growing Spirit, and for the newness that sometimes come from our word. We have indeed been in the counsel of your summoning Spirit, and so we know some truth to speak. But we are as well filled with rich imagination of our own, and our imagination is sometimes matched and overmatched by our own cowardice, by our own readiness to please, by our quest for well-being. We are on most days a hard mix of true prophet and wayward voice, a mix of your call to justice and our hope for shalom. Here we are, as we are, mixed but faithful, compromised but committed, anxious but devoted to you. Use our gifts, O God, for your newness that pushes beyond all that we can say or imagine. We are grateful for words given us. We are even more grateful for your word fleshed among us. Amen.